Today we're going to talk a little bit about Chicago Manual of Style. Chicago Manual of Style is a citation style or a way of formatting your paper that's used by historians, including art historians. And unlike MLA or APA, which you may be more familiar with, Chicago style is actually a style that's used primarily for publishing your work. This means there's a version of Chicago style, often called Turabian style, that is used by students and has more relaxed requirements. However, when we do internet searches or when we're looking for information or help on these styles, Chicago Manual of Style will often come up with the information that you need. Like MLA or APA, there's lots of online resources to help you use Chicago Manual of Style. And I've listed a couple at the top of this slide. The first one is the OWL at Purdue. I've mentioned this resource before. This is the online writing lab from Purdue University, and they have a lot of great, up-to-date information about Chicago Manual of Style. The second website that you see here is the official citation guide from Chicago Manual of Style. If you run across a particularly obscure or tricky issue, they have lots of great assistance on their site, but I think their information is generally a little harder to understand than the OWL at Purdue, which is aimed specifically towards students. So either of those are great resources. One of the trickiest things about using Chicago style is that there's actually two forms of it. There's something called the NB, or Notes and Bibliography form, or there's an author date form. The author date form looks a lot like APA style, where you use in-text citations, that is information in parentheses in the text of your essay, and you cite your sources that way. That style is not the style we're using in this class. Historians typically use the NB, or Notes and Bibliography form, which cites your sources in a footnote. So you're looking for examples that use footnotes and a bibliography at the end, rather than any kind of in-text citations. I also have a list of things here that are common issues or common errors that students run into, especially the first time they use Chicago style. And some of these are just problems that people struggle with when formatting. So, for instance, on our first bullet point, every time you use a source, it must have both a footnote and a bibliographic entry. So, one thing that people often struggle with is that we put a lot of information in the footnotes. It often feels more like writing a works cited page or a references page than writing an in-text citation. So, often people feel like, I wrote my footnote, I'm done, I don't need to do anything else. That's not the case. You need to have both footnotes and a bibliography to have completely cited your sources in Chicago style. Similarly, even though the footnotes have more information than you may be used to, you need to have a footnote every time you cite your source, just like you would use an in-text citation. However, the first time you cite a source in a footnote, it's quite a long process. Like I said, it's very similar to what we might put on a references or a works cited page. The second and any additional times you cite a source, you can use a shortened form that includes just the author's name, the title, and the page number. The other place that people often struggle using Chicago Manual style for the first time is in the formatting. Honestly, most of these problems are easily avoided if you use your resources, if you use the insert footnote tool in your word processor rather than trying to do your format by hand. But some of the common problems that I see is that each footnote must have its own number, regardless of whether you've used a source before or not. That means that often people try to say, okay, this is my first source, it's going to be number 1. Every time I put a footnote in my paper, I'm going to use the number 1. That's not how footnotes work. Footnotes should be numbered sequentially, starting with 1 at the beginning of our paper and counting up all the way through our paper. So it doesn't matter how many times you've used a source, or if a source has different numbers assigned to it, the numbers of our footnotes should be sequential. Similarly, the numbers of our footnotes should be indicated in the text through superscript. That means that tiny writing above the main line of the text. And again, if you use your insert footnote tool in your word processor, this will all happen automatically. It's mostly when people try to control their formatting by hand that they struggle with these issues. I've also given you these basic example footnotes and bibliographic entries to give you an idea of what you should be looking for. One of the trickiest things about Chicago Manual of Style is that we put a lot of information in both the footnote and the bibliographic entry, and they're very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So if we look at this first entry for a book, if we start with the footnote, we list the author's name exactly as it is on the page, rather than starting with their first name, or excuse me, with their last name. So we have the author, first name and then their last name, the title of the book in italics, the place of publication, publisher, and date in parentheses, and then we end with a page number. This is because the purpose of a footnote is to direct your reader to a specific idea or quote that you're borrowing from one of your sources. So it's doing the same thing as an in-text citation would. In contrast, if we look at the bibliography, we still start with the author's name, but we start with their last name, then we put a comma, and then their first name. This lets us alphabetize our bibliography by author's last name, which is how we organize that piece of paper. We still start with the title, then have the title of our page in italics, still the place of publication, publisher, and date, and notice there's no parentheses in the bibliography. We also don't end with the page number because having something in our bibliography just says this is one of the things I read. This is one of my sources that I used to write this paper. Similarly, in the journal article, we start in the footnote with the author as their name appears, titled the article in quotation marks, and the title of the journal in italics. We then have volume number, issue number, and date, and again the page numbers. In the bibliography, once again, we start with the author's last name, comma, their first name. Again, we see similar information, title of the article, title of the journal, volume number, and issue number, but in a journal article bibliography entry, we end with all the pages used. So this doesn't mean you need to go through your paper and say, okay, I used page 29 and page 32 and page 34. They're looking to say, okay, this journal article starts on page 28 and it ends on page 36. So you would write 28-36. These page numbers are just another way to double check that if I went and got this journal from the library and I was looking this up, I would know what page numbers to look at. Our last example here is a website. This is probably going to be the most useful to most of you. And the website, the footnote, and the bibliographic entry are the most similar. The only real difference is between the way the author's name is formatted. Also note that for websites, on some occasions we may not have a real name. Obviously, our best, most academic sources, we want to try to find as much kind of authoritative information about them as we can, but it is possible that sometimes we may just have a username or some kind of an internet handle associated with certain online content. If that's all you have, use that. It's better to have some name or some kind of identifier for the author than nothing. After that, we have the title of the web page. If you don't see a title on the page itself, don't forget to look up in your browser bar at the top of the page. Then the publishing organization, so this is the person or people who's paying to have this information online. Again, with academic information, this is often going to be the name of a museum or maybe the name of a media company like Academy or History. Then we have the publication or access date. So publication date is our preferred piece of information. But again, we don't always have that information online. Sometimes we can't find when things were published. So if you can't find that, use an access date. So instead of a publication date, you'd simply write accessed on, followed by the date that you found that information. We end that footnote or bibliography entry with the URL or other kind of online information. If you have a DOI, a digital online identifier, you can use that piece of information, which is shorter and more concise than the URL. For all three of these formats, we can make a shortened form of the footnote. So for the book, the version you see here is the first time you cite that source. The second time, you'll just use the author, the title, and the page number. Similarly, for a journal article, the footnote we see here is the first time you cite that source. The second and any additional times, we can use the author's name, the title of the article, and the page number. For a website, we use the author's name, the title of the web page, and the URL in those shortened versions.